Today, I'm making underwear from a vintage sewing pattern. Will they be saggy or sexy? Make sure you watch to the end to find out. I bought this pattern on Etsy a few years back and it recently surfaced in my collection. It was designed by So Lovely for a men's cotton knit briefs, pattern number M36C, copyright 1971. The pattern itself was printed on actual paper rather than tissue paper and looked like it hadn't been used. Not surprisingly, it had some deep creases from being folded up for nearly 50 years, so I pressed it with a dry iron to get it flat. My prediction is that these underwear aren't going to fit great at all because they're only one pattern piece, so I'm not sure how you really get any good shaping or fit with only one pattern piece. Out of curiosity, I asked ChatGPT about the availability of spandex fabrics in 1971, which confirmed what I suspected. Although spandex existed, fabrics containing it were not widely available to home sewers at the time. This pattern was designed for 100% cotton knit, which isn't something I normally buy. Knits that are blended with spandex have much better recovery and wearability over time. Instead of the cotton knit, I substituted a bamboo rib knit that had spandex in it, and for the waistband elastic, I used this striped underwear elastic. Since I used a material with more stretch than was called for, I sized down from my normal size on the pattern, and went with the smallest size included. I'd really prefer a tighter fit over saggy underwear, so we'll see how it turns out. I cut the one pattern piece out on the fold of the fabric with a small rotary cutter, and this is what the full pattern piece looks like when it's opened up. And I cut the waistband elastic based on the size chart. Once I took a look at the instructions, I realized I needed to cut a few binding pieces. I cut those out from some white polyester ITY knit because I liked the white and blue color combination. The bindings were cut with the greatest stretch of the fabric in the length. One set was for the fly front bindings, which were cut at 1¼ inches wide. The pattern also referred to a second set of bindings as tapes, which were for the stripes on the side of the pouch, and those were cut 1¾ inches wide. Although this pattern may be difficult for you to find, I do hope you will take away some tips and tricks from seeing how I approached the assembly and sewing in the next segment. The first step was to attach the bindings for the fly front along these curves here. First, I stitched the binding right sides facing to the fly. Then, I folded the binding twice to create a roll which enclosed all the raw edges, and I zigzag stitched it in place using matching thread. If you'd like the look of this knit edge finish, check out my other video where I discuss this method in more detail. With the fly front bindings finished, next was the crotch seam. This part was interesting because you had to catch 3 layers in one. You place one fly on the front, one fly on the back, and the crotch sandwiched in the middle. After you stitch them together and turn things right side out, it just kind of works with no exposed seam allowance. There were these lines on the pattern I forgot to mark, so I had to get out some tracing paper to mark those before moving on. These lines mark where the sides of the pouch get stitched down, as well as the placement for the white stripes on the front of the briefs. After that, I pinned everything in place and made a short row of stitching at the top of these lines to hold the briefs together on each side of the pouch. Next, I got my second set of binding strips, which are stitched along the transferred lines. These are really just for looks, but it does enclose the one raw edge above the fly on the outside. With the binding folded in half, I placed both raw edges along each of the lines. Then used a narrow zigzag stitch to attach them, close to the raw edges. At this point, I got out one of my all-time favorite sewing tools, which is wash-away seam tape. This stuff is great for temporarily securing things without pins, and it completely disappears in the wash later. I placed the seam tape directly on the white binding tapes, then folded it away from the center front and secured it down. I highly recommend this sewing tool, so make sure you visit my Amazon affiliate links in the description below to order yours. Plus, see all my other favorite sewing supplies. I earn a small commission at no extra cost to you. Next, with the binding tapes temporarily secured, I used a wide zigzag stitch to permanently attach them, which also enclosed the raw edges in the process. To make sure I got those stripe details nice and flat, I pressed them with steam using a press cloth. Here's an image showing the progress so far. The next step, according to the instructions, was to cut another set of strips to make bands for the leg openings. These were 2 1/4 inches wide. I didn't like how the instructions described this next step, so I changed things up a bit when it comes to the sewing. The method I used is a great way to attach bands to all kinds of knit openings, so pay attention here. First, I used this flexible ruler to measure the exact length of the leg openings, which was 16 1/4 inches. I multiplied 16 1/4 inches times 0.9, which equals 14 5/8. In other words, I determined a length that was 90% of the leg opening. This is a good rule of thumb for any kind of bands on knit openings like neck bands or arm openings, because having a band that's slightly smaller keeps the opening from gaping. I added a 1/2 inch to 14 5/8 for the seam allowance, which is a 1/4 inch at each end of the band, to stitch them into loops. The loops were formed by stitching the short ends of the fabric strips with right sides facing. Next, I used the quartering method and sewing clips to match the bands to the leg openings. The quartering method is a clever trick for evenly distributing stretch when attaching a smaller knit piece, like a neckband, waistband, or cuff, to a larger opening. It helps prevent puckering, twisting, or uneven gathering, especially when the band needs to be stretched to fit. Here's how it works. The idea is that you need to find quarter points on both the opening and the band. Usually, I use a seam as the first quarter point. With the first quarter point determined, walk the edges together to find the point exactly opposite the first point. That's quarter point 2. Then, match those 2 points in the middle, and the fabric folds on each side will be quarter points 3 and 4. The quarter points of the band get matched to the quarter points of the opening using pins or sewing clips. Normally, I will clip the quarter points with scissors to make notches, but marking the folds with chalk also works well too. The quartering method is complicated to explain but easy to do in practice, but it is important to help you evenly distribute the stretch of the band around the larger opening for professional looking results. To attach the bands, I started stitching in the round at the crotch seam, matching 3 raw edges, which were the 2 raw edges of the band and 1 raw edge of the brief's leg opening. While stitching, I applied a gentle stretch to the white band, but not to the blue fabric. Finally, to finish the leg opening bands, I stitched the seam allowance down flat using a zigzag stitch from the outside of the briefs. This step was optional, but I felt like the flat seams made a more professional finish. Here's what I assembled so far, which leaves the last step of attaching the waistband. To stitch the waistband into a loop, I sewed the short raw edges together, right sides facing, using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then, I used a short zigzag stitch to secure the raw edges flat to the waistband, which also finished the edges. Here, I used the quartering method again, placing the seam in the waistband at the center back of the briefs. The instructions wanted you to attach the raw edge of the fabric toward the bottom of the waistband, but I chose to match it at the top of the waistband instead. It's much easier to sew with the top edges matched, and the waist looked like it was going to be really high on the body anyway, so I didn't think it would hurt to lower it some. To stitch the waistband to the briefs, I used a 3-step zigzag stitch placed toward the bottom edge of the elastic. Since the waistband was smaller than the opening, I did have to stretch it to match from both the front and the back while stitching. That's pretty normal when attaching a waistband because you want the waistband to fit securely to the body. I started stitching in the round at the center back of the briefs, stitching all the way around, then overlapping my starting stitches a small amount. Lastly, I turned the briefs inside out and used a small pair of sharp scissors to trim the excess fabric above the stitching line. You need to be super careful doing something like this because it would stink to accidentally cut a hole in something after doing all that work. It works best to pull the fabric away from you with the hand not holding the scissors. That way, you can cut close to the stitching. That was the last and final step to finish these vintage briefs. From a construction standpoint, I think they turned out great. Now for the real test. Are these vintage underwear sexy or saggy? Let's find out. Final verdict? Honestly, they're not too bad. They do definitely sit up high on the waist like grandpa underwear, but they're comfortable and supportive, and other than that, the fit is not too bad. I would actually wear these on a regular day. I think that the modifications that I made probably helped, far as picking a fabric that had spandex in it and also lowering the waist a little bit. But they turned out really nice. I think I would like to make a few more of them. To answer the question, are these underwear saggy or sexy? Honestly, I would say neither. I think they're a good fitting basic underwear that you might wear on a regular basis. Probably not going to get you any dates, but they're comfortable and practical enough. That's all for this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and maybe I inspired you to sew your own underwear from a vintage pattern. I do have a couple other vintage patterns in my collection that I hope to sew up for other videos. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share, and I'll see you in the next video. Happy sewing!